Howdy, Fire Emblem gamers! So, when Nintendo initially announced their plans to break into the mobile game market, I don't think anyone could have predicted the absolute juggernaut that Fire Emblem Heroes would become, especially when their initial offerings consisted of Miitomo and Super Mario Run, the former of which was a glorified Facebook personality quiz, and the latter of which was, let's not mince our words here, pretty much dead on arrival. But the madmen at Intelligent Systems did it and managed to turn a series of heavily story-driven RPGs, with a traditionally notorious high barrier to entry, into a bite-sized mobile game that just about anyone could pick up and play. Fire Emblem Heroes was actually my first run-in with the gacha game genre. Back then, times were simpler and my wallet was happier, but everything changed when Faye entered my life as sort of a gateway drug into the world of microtransactions. It's just as well, seeing as how Fire Emblem Awakening of all things was my push down the rabbit hole into weebdom, so to speak. I couldn't help it, they made Robin and Lucina look so much cooler than every other character in their Smash 4 reveal trailer, complete with a gorgeous animated cinematic and the actual full English voice acting, something that was mostly foreign to the Smash series at that point. Anyways, forking out cash hand over fist for gacha waifus was pretty much the next logical progression. That little trip down memory lane aside, Fire Emblem Heroes is one of those games where popular conversation outside of the core community involves riveting discussion topics such as quitting Fire Emblem Heroes. It's undoubtedly a huge success for the franchise and Nintendo as a whole, being their most successful non-Pokemon mobile game by a country mile, but that said, it does tend to draw a lot of ire, both from internal and external sources in the fandom. Now, as someone who has either dipped a toe or done a full-on plunge into numerous gacha games, that level of negativity just seems to be par for the course. It really does come with the genre. But for some reason I do kind of get the impression that Faye has garnered a particularly bad reputation within certain circles at least. Now obviously it's nowhere near the worst as far as gacha games go, simply due to the sheer fact that it's still going strong, with no obvious end in sight. But seeing as how I have held, let's say, varying levels of fondness for the game over the years since its launch, I thought it would be fun to take a look at some of the common criticisms and see how well they hold up under scrutiny. So for the obligatory brief introduction, Fire Emblem Heroes is a mobile gacha game based on the Fire Emblem series, a grid-based strategy RPG that was later expanded to add dating sim elements. Interestingly enough, Nintendo, or at least Sakurai from Smash Bros., considers Fire Emblem Heroes to be a numbered main series entry in the Fire Emblem franchise. This is up for discussion, but seeing as how it absolutely topples every other game in the series based purely on revenue, I suppose you could argue that it's earned its spot. Now what I do want to know is, who do I talk to about getting Tokyo Mirage Sessions recognized as mainline? The truth cannot stay suppressed forever. Taking a look at some of the common criticisms raised against the game, some of the more reoccurring ones that come to mind immediately are the story and writing, the gameplay balance, and just general woes with the gacha system. There are, of course, others like grindy gameplay and blatant character favoritisms, but the one mentioned previously I feel are a bit more substantial to discuss. The first, and frankly lowest hanging fruit to take a swing at when looking at a gacha game, is the very nature of gacha. People will throw around buzzwords like predatory and unethical, and sure, I'm not trying to dispute that or anything, but that's just like the standard bar of awfulness set for every gacha game. So the question we should be asking really is, how does Faye stack up among its contemporaries? Well, to be honest, the gacha is probably one of the better ones I've seen, just going off all the features and goodies included in it, although that comes with some massive caveats. Let's break it down a little bit. So the default 5-star hero rate is 6%, which is split between 3% for an on-banner focus hero and 3% for the general 5-star pool. Faye, oh so magnanimously, features 2 safety net systems, being a spark system where you can pick up a guaranteed focus unit after 40 summons, and an increasing pity rate which will increase the 5-star rate the more orbs you spend on a specific banner without pulling a 5-star. The increased rate will reset completely upon pulling a 5-star focus unit, or by 1% upon pulling a general pool 5-star. And on top of that, Fae also gives 1 free summon on each banner, as well as occasionally running mythic and legendary banners, which have increased odds and a limited selection of 5 stars. Basically, Fae gives its players many of the beneficial features found in various other gacha games, making it all around a pretty nice system. Furthermore, Fae has the rather unique system of the colored orbs, and while it is largely illusion of choice, it does give you some modicum of control over the outcome. Well, that's all well and good, but what's the catch? As any surface level analysis will tell you, pity rates and safety nets act more as an encouragement to spend where you might have otherwise not been tempted to. While it's undeniable that they're a boon to the player, it is definitely something that can serve as a little bit of a trap. And to add on to this, to max out a single unit fully, you will have to merge duplicates up to a plus 10, meaning that 11 copies of the same character would have to be obtained. If you're gunning for specific characters, you'll be fighting that focus rate split among all the other 5 stars in that rarity bracket, making the rates a bit lower than they might seem at first glance. While the power boost is definitely noticeable for maxing out characters, the main importance comes from the score boost that merges give in certain game modes. So for people trying to metagame, the gacha can be pretty rough, but for collectors and people mostly going for their favorites, I would say it's decently manageable, if not outright good. Relatively speaking, of course. And when talking about marginal power boosts, we can't neglect the existence of traits, something that has pissed off many a player in the early days of Fae especially. In an effort to copy the random growths that Fire Emblem proper is famous for, all summoned units can randomly have one stat have a slight boost and one stat with a slight decrease. Getting that fancy new 5-star meta carry unit with a minus attack trait certainly was a bitter pill to swallow. Thankfully over the years they have actually made many strides to address these woes, such as merges removing the flaws, being able to change traits outright with trait fruits, and also just the fact that power creep with character stats and skills has overall made a bad trait significantly less impactful. That's a can of worms to be opened at a slightly later time. Well, I avoided mentioning it earlier, but there is perhaps one more elephant in the room. I am, of course, talking about the Fae Pass, the subscription system that, for a small monthly fee, will grant you some bonus resources, special outfits for older characters, and, most bizarrely, certain quality of life features that probably shouldn't be locked behind a paywall. Namely, the extended auto battle and being able to spark on legendary banners. Now, I don't want to go too much into the Fae Pass. You can make entire video essays ranting about it, and people have done just that. Much of the initial outrage has faded over time, as outrage tends to do, so it is really up to the individual to decide if it's worth it. I will say that, just looking at it kind of objectively, it is a pretty decent value if you play regularly and you're going to be spending money on the game anyways. So all in all, the gacha for Fire Emblem Heroes is a bit of a mixed bag, but if you held a gun to my head and made me choose a side, I would be inclined to lean more towards it being good. Again, relatively speaking, when put up against all the other gacha games. Yeah, it has its scummy practices, but all of them do, and it has enough boons where I would consider it to be somewhat of a lesser evil, in a way. As I alluded to earlier, the game balance is another point of irritation for many players, both past and present. Power creep is something that exists more or less in most games that have continuous content support, but Fae in particular has had a pretty bad rep when it comes to that. Understandably, power creep is just somewhat of a natural consequence. They gotta keep adding fresh new ideas to keep the player base engaged and the cash flowing. But admittedly, it is a little egregious comparing skill and weapon descriptions throughout the years, seeing them go from 1 or 2 lines to looking like Yu-Gi-Oh card effects. I'm not talking about the boomer Yu-Gi-Oh, Pot of Greed lets me summon 3 cards kind of stuff, but like modern day Pendulum, Synchro, Nirvana, High Paladin levels of card text. From a surface level analysis, it is totally fathomable how rampant power creep could turn players off to the game. After all, if you brave the gacha to summon for the hot new character, only for them to become obsolete shortly after, can definitely be a demoralizing experience. Even more so when you factor in heavy investment character projects, and especially when you start to factor in real money transactions. That said, I do feel like, to an extent, the accusations of power creep are somewhat overblown, at least in certain respects. The complexity of the skill inheritance system really allows you to build up your favorites to the point where almost any character can be brought up to competent levels, albeit at the cost of premium 5-star gacha characters usually. Dragon fruits also help combat stat creep to an extent by allowing higher stat gains for older characters, but time and time again it has been proven that this is not enough on its own. And finally, the weapon refines that are put out in batches every month or so go a long ways in modernizing the older characters. That said, when it comes to refines, there are clear winners and losers, even still. So unless they go back and do re-refines at some point, the future doesn't look too bright for certain heroes. Now, while you can build up your favorites and have them be competent for most game modes, there is still a pretty well-defined meta for the PvP and the AI PvP game modes. Although you can really make anything work with just a little bit of strategy, core thresholds notwithstanding. I mean, there are communities and channels dedicated to using entirely free-to-play hero teams to beat the hardest PvE content in the game, so it's definitely possible. Let's not forget that Fire Emblem is still a big-brain strategy game at its core, and not just a waifu sim. So to summarize this section, the game balance in Fae is, well, it's fine, arguably. It's kind of a tricky subject since how much it affects you depends on what you really want to get out of the game. During the awkward formative puberty years of the game, before the skill inheritance system and refinery became as robust as it is now, I would have said that power creep has had a much more profound effect. But as it stands now, the vast array of customization options serves as a pretty big boon to casual players. Yes, everyone will remember the standout moments like the unkillable fallen Edelgards and the rampaging Kroms, but for the most part, there is a nice degree of flexibility afforded to the players. And for those interested in high-level gameplay, well, that's a rabbit hole I would argue you should go down once you really understand what you're getting into. Finally, the third point of criticism, and admittedly one that has tapered off to an extent over the years, is how the story and writing is handled in Fae. Now, I should preface this by saying that the story itself isn't the issue necessarily, but rather the way it is presented. That is to say, the story beats and original characters are all pretty interesting, and there's a lot of potential there for sure, but the writing just suffers immensely from brevity in this case. The main story is delivered in short segments about once a month roughly, coinciding with the release of a new hero banner. To be honest, each of the individual books after Book 2 have really interesting plot lines that could easily be expanded into a competent full Fire Emblem storyline in their own right. Just with how short they all are, it ends up being that the unique characters don't really get a chance to do much of interest. That's not even getting started on the already established Fire Emblem characters, whose only purpose is to show up, make a brief introduction, and then fight you. Now obviously it would be impossible to fit that many characters into a plot, but they at least made an effort with some of the earlier chapters, like with Xander and Katarina having somewhat expanded roles. That was kind of neat, but they never really did anything with that idea afterwards. Now, mobile games don't exactly live and die by their stories, just as there are gacha games that have rich and compelling narratives like Fate Grand Order and Grand Blue Fantasy. There are plenty of others that eschew lengthy stories and dialogues to focus on other aspects. Now that's all well and good. It seems very likely that Fire Emblem Heroes was initially designed to run in a similar vein. Book 1, and to a lesser extent, a lot of Book 2, were about as bare-bones excuse plot as you can get. Whether it was the runaway success of the game, or just the desire to expand its scope, Book 3 saw much more fleshed out scenarios and original characters. The form factor still left much to be desired, however. To its credit, modes like Forging Bonds, as well as beefing up the dialogue sections in Paralogs and Tempest Trials, did do quite a bit to give Fire Emblem fans those much-desired character interaction moments, but it's never enough. Small things like dialogue and unique interactions based on heroes you have in your roster go a long way in deepening the connection gacha players have with their characters, and Faye did somewhat miss the boat on that. Going back and adding lines retroactively at this point seems pretty unreasonable, though. While the character art and voice acting is usually pretty fantastic, each individual character can feel a little bit soulless at times. Well, that's definitely a bit of an extreme take, but it is a shame that a game based so heavily around characters that fans already have deep existing attachments to couldn't really do more with them. Now, that's very likely a product of the sheer volume of characters that get pumped out at regular intervals, so I suppose it simply cannot be helped. Anyways, while many people can enjoy Fae for what it is, mostly for the gameplay and waifu/husbando collecting purposes, it is unfortunate that it is hard to recommend the game based on the merits of its story. While modern Fire Emblem writing has been somewhat of a mixed bag in the eyes of the fandom, it is one of the more narrative-focused Nintendo franchises for sure. This is of course all speculation, but the initial hard pivot away from that could potentially be what caused it to not resonate with a lot of Fire Emblem fans. Now, after all that, if I were to pass my verdict overall, I would say that I still do view Fire Emblem Heroes relatively favorably. While it does have a lot of missed potential, the developers have shown that they aren't too afraid to implement crazy ideas and game modes, and to their credit, it was probably difficult to predict the game becoming the runaway success to the extent that it is now. There is a lot that Fae does right, lots of game modes going in and out of rotation to keep the gameplay loop somewhat fresh without being overly grindy. It is a nice change of pace to be spending time having to figure out a difficult map rather than mindlessly running the same quest repeatedly. Don't get me wrong, there's still a good amount of that classic grind, but having played plenty of other gachas, it's not quite on the same level. Still, it is a gacha. For ethical reasons, I can't exactly say that I do recommend playing it, but if you had to pick one, I would say that it's for sure one that's worth checking out. With Fire Emblem being an ongoing franchise that's still standing strong, it's safe to assume that Fae has a healthy lifespan ahead of it, and God, I hope I didn't just jinx something fierce right now.